So, I guess to start, like, if you could just take me through your process, researching and writing as a philosophy. I mean, I assume that your role as a scholar is writing,
Right.
mostly. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it depends on the thing I'm writing. So, if I'm writing a book, obviously the research is more involved, more expansive. If I'm writing an article, it's tighter.
Okay.
But in general, the process is similar. I usually begin with a question, and the question, so something I'm working on right now, for example. So I'm trying to figure out what I think about the difference between philosophy and theology,
Okay.
and how to make sense of that distinction. So I start off by making sure I get a good sense of what the question is that I'm asking. Not just is there a thing that is philosophy, but even if there's not, how do we differentiate between philosophy and theology? How is this distinction something that matters for the contemporary debates? How are we going to relate this to, some particular set of literature that I'm, engaging and looking at? So for me, the particular space is what's called contemporary phenomenology, and so I am engaging that set of literature to ask this question with a particular focus. So once I kind of understand what it is I'm asking, what it is I'm investigating, and sometimes that shows up just as a title or a topic. I mean, I'll sometimes be saying, like, recently I did a piece, the editor said, hey, we want you to write something on philosophy of religion after religion. And so, like, all right, I'm not even quite sure what that means, but so I ended up going into the project thinking, well, what does religion mean for philosophers of religion? So let's start there and move forward, right? So once I kind of get the question in place, then I try, depending on the amount of time I've got, try to read everything I can find that is relevant to that question.
Okay.
That, like I say, sometimes I'm able to pull that off more than others. Right now on sabbatical, I'm able to do a fairly good job of that. Other semesters, I've got a deadline, and you just, I've read a lot, and so you make use of what you've read, and then the writing for me, though, I am a very fast writer. Some people are very slow and meticulous. I'm not. I'm a write and rewrite and think about it, and I write to figure out what I think in response to the question. I don't figure out, okay, here's the question, here's my answer, here's how I'm going to lay it out, here's how I'm going to work through. I haven't got a clue. I start by writing in order to figure out what it turns out I think about that, and half the time I finish the paper and I was like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. I guess that's what I think.
Yeah.
And so that allows me to write quickly, hopefully not sloppily, but I mean, I can write fast, but then the revision process, the reworking process, the rethinking, that's kind of where, for me, getting done and getting good, like that difference starts happening for me in the revisions.
Okay. So, yeah, the next question is how you manage a big research project. That's sort of how you're...
Yeah, I mean, books are weird. I've written a few books, and I think big research projects, the only two differences I think between them and small research project is that big ones require that you be able to sustain some sort of through line across all the chapters. The chapters can't just be separate things all that happen to kind of come together. It's got to be, there's a reason why I'm doing this next chapter in relation to the chapter I just wrote and anticipating a chapter I'm going to write.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean that you have to write them all in order. It doesn't mean that you have to approach it as a single thing. I mean, I write sometimes most effectively when I take it as a bunch of little small chunks. Okay. But the whole way through, I'm always thinking, all right, how am I connecting this back again to that guiding question? So for me, it's all about the question that I'm asking. If I don't have the question in place, and I think this is especially true for student writers, they think they can talk about something without answering a question. And in philosophy, talking about something is never the goal. Okay. You're trying to say something in response to a question.
Okay. So, how much do you rely on research versus like your own opinions about
Research should only ever be something that is deployed as data or evidence for your opinions.
Okay.
So now that said, like I don't just have my opinions and then do research.
Mm-hmm.
You often are doing research again to figure out what you think about something. But this is why like I require my students to write in the first person. You know,
Mm-hmm.
what are you going to argue? I'm going to argue this in this paper. Because again, if all you're doing is simply talking about what other people have said, you know, cool, like history does that. That sounds awesome. It's another discipline. It's not philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if what you're going to do is just talk about how you feel about something, also cool. You know, a lot of literary criticism does that, not philosophy. Philosophy is, you know, what do you think is true as supported by the best evidence that you can mount to that conclusion.
Uh-huh.
That's something that only happens when you're bouncing your ideas off of the other people who think about the same thing.
Okay.
You know, so I'd say, you know, I might research for a month or 2 months and then write a paper in a week.
Mm-hmm.
But I never sit down to write a paper without having kind of done my homework. It doesn't make any sense, because then I don't know what I think about it until I write it. But unless I've been thinking about it by thinking through all these other texts, you know, it might as well just be a diary entry or something.
Okay.
You know.
So, what sort of is your audience when you're trying to write?
I mean, it depends. My primary audience are other philosophers. I mean, I'm interested in talking to philosophers about philosophy. Sometimes I'm writing to religious studies scholars, which requires slightly different foci, slightly different literature, slightly different texts that are taken as familiar. You know, that shifts. Sometimes I write for more popular audiences, and that's a whole different ballgame. Like when I do that, I never do it in a way that is disconnected from the research I do scholarly, but it is stuff that's not meant to sort of show my scholarly chops or to make some strong claim. It's more to kind of encourage reflection and encourage thinking about something that is more popularly engaged. So, you know, like in my church setting, for example, you know, the role of women in the church, or how do we make sense of race, or how are we going to understand the role of prayer, or these kind of things. These are hard questions, but I'm not writing to scholars when I talk about that for the church. I'm talking to other people who don't have academic backgrounds, and so trying to say, look, let me show you why there might be a question you haven't thought about. You know,
so both like what you're trying to convince them of also changes, but also like your diction.
Yeah, the way you do it. It's more informal. It's more conversational. Though I'm not a big fan of jargony technical scholarship anyway. I think nuance matters, but showing that you can use big words or that you can be jargony, I think is overrated. So I think even in the highest scholarship that I do, I'm still trying to write clearly, lucidly. You know, I want to be courageous enough that people can understand what I'm claiming, so they can come refute me.
Okay. Specifically, what kind of source citing do you use, and how do you who do you submit your work to?
Yeah, source citing depends on the journal, depends on the press. Dr. Thomas will probably get mad at me, but I, for example, think it's not all that helpful to spend a lot of time teaching students how to cite sources, because as long as you can say, hey, here's the book that I'm referencing, 99.9% of the time, the place has copy editors that are going back and taking care of that stuff for you. Right now I'm editing several books, and so I'm actually going in and fixing all the citations for all these big scholars. You know, as long as they give me the information, where the book was published, what the title, who's a translator, what are the pages, you know, the specific format is something you do relative to presses. So I'm not a big fan of like spending 3 weeks in a freshman seminar to say, make sure you get your commas right. Yeah, I just think I'd rather get my thinking right more than my commas. But in general, I'm a fan of parenthetical citation, just because you don't have to have so many footnotes. And anymore, footnotes and notes are getting pushed to the end of the books, and nobody reads them anyway. And so I'm just not a big fan of that. But yeah, I guess that's kind of how I'd put it. Yeah.
Did you say who you submit it to?
Oh, no. So it depends on the project. So earlier in my career, almost everything I was writing were journal articles that then I would send to a journal in philosophy. So I might send it to Journal of Religious Ethics, or I might send it to Philosophy in the Contemporary World, or send it to Noose or something. And then they review it, send it out to peer review. They either accept it or don't. They ask for revisions, etc. And so you go through this whole process, and eventually it comes out in that journal. Other times, I would get invited to write something for a book that was being put together, and so I would be submitting it to the editor, who's then putting together this book manuscript and then sending it off to the press. Now, I almost entirely, though I'm not sure this is good or bad, it's just what it is. The vast majority of what I write now is all for invitation. So even journals, now I don't as much send it out to a journal for them to review it and consider it. It's the journal editors contacting me saying, hey, we're doing an issue on this topic. You're an expert in the field. Can you contribute something to it? And so that's where then the vast majority of my writing now is not actually being submitted. It's being requested and commissioned, and then I write, for these different places.
Cool.
So,
and then, I don't know, maybe just a couple more things.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you feel about research and writing? Is it just something you have to do, or is it something you enjoy, or is it?
It's why I get out of bed. It's why I went to grad school. I think the difference between a college, university professor and a high school teacher is research and writing. And if you're not going to do research and writing, we might as well teach high school, which is not a bad thing. It isn't like an evaluative good or bad. It's to say that is for me the difference. Just teaching another Shakespeare class, but a slightly more complicated level. The difference between us and high school teachers is that our teaching flows out of the fact that we are producing the knowledge we teach. We're not simply telling others about the knowledge that other people produce. And so we got to be research and writing. That's what it is to be a scholar. Absolutely.
So you said you write everything first person. You as well, not just your students. Everything.
Everything's in first person. Now, it doesn't mean that it's inappropriately personal. It doesn't mean I'm talking about that one time when my grandma spanked me for stealing a cookie kind of stuff. It's more just saying I'm the one who owns the arguments I make. In this paper I'm arguing this, here's why I think this thing, I believe this other thing. So it's never appealing to my own beliefs or thoughts as authoritative. It's just owning the fact that papers don't argue, people do.
Ask how scholarship is related to a discipline. That seems so broad. I don't understand.
Well, I mean, so scholarship in philosophy, like I was saying earlier, is different than scholarship in history or scholarship in education. My view is, in philosophy, I mean, this isn't distinctive. It's just what we do, but a lot of disciplines do this. I mean, we are guided by argument, motivated by argument. Everything we do should come back to the argument you can give for something being true. We are truth seekers, concerned with argumentation, and so there's lots of ways to then have different evidence sets. History has historical record as its evidence set. Sociology has people groups and movements as its evidence set. That's why it's more of a social science than classics, which is more sort of this combination of literature and history and sociology and archaeology and philosophy kind of all rolled in together. Philosophy is question driven, truth seeking, supported by argumentation. The evidence can then be whatever evidence you want to appeal to support the claim that you're making. It's not restricted to what can be proven in a lab, or what can be supported by empirical data. It's empirical data is one kind of data. There's other kind of data. In philosophy, what I like about it is our evidence set's big enough to in my opinion, care about what is true, full stop, not just care about what is true relative to what we can prove in a lab in a study, in a repeatable practice. You know, like that's one way of proving stuff. You know, there's other ways to do it.
Yeah.
So